Yes, people. Welcome to Saeed TV and welcome to the Rivals Talk. And we are here today with a very, very special guest. We have sports correspondent Ben Jacobs. Ben, how are you? Thanks for coming on. Appreciate it.
Always a pleasure. I was listening to your music leading into the show and it was spa-like, and I was half expecting somebody to bring me a water with a bit of mint in it. But it's glad to kind of be here and looking forward to it, really. And also very intrigued to see how Manchester United kick off after the World Cup ends.
That's what we want to see. That's what we want to see. Thanks for honestly taking your time out. I really, really rate your stuff. I think for me, you're one of the most underrated out there. People talk about Fabrizio Romano, but I think for me, Ben Jacobs, you've got to follow him on Twitter. Very, very fascinating. I love what you do, so I appreciate you coming on. And like I said, Grizz as well, we're honoured. How are you, Grizz?
I'm honoured as well. I'm honoured as well. Slightly disappointed you didn't give me the big build-up Ben got, but it's okay. I'm used to it now. It's okay. I'm used to it now. But no, absolute honour and pleasure to be sharing a platform with Ben as well. First time we've spoken as well. Nice to meet you and nice to speak to you.
Absolutely. Ben, you joined the World Cup, obviously. We're back to Premier League football. How are you finding it, the transition from the World Cup to the Premier League? Has it sunk in now? Is it gone now, the feeling now? Are you ready for the Premier League?
There's not much time. That's the first thing to say. So we wait and see how that influences the very first January market following a World Cup. But I was out in Doha. I lived in Doha for a couple of years as well. Fantastic World Cup on the football side. Greatest ever final. Brilliant to see the Messi fairy tale. But also in addition to that, I really enjoyed the Morocco run into the business end of the tournament. They finished fourth in the end, but to make those final days of a World Cup was astonishing. And then even some of the upsets that didn't have a bearing in the end proved to be very good stories. Tunisia beating France, but they didn't go through. Saudi Arabia beating Argentina, but Argentina went on to win the tournament. And I think that we as journalists get a lot of good access at a World Cup usually, but it's never been a one city World Cup. So that was quite intriguing that you could suddenly get to every game, every story, get real insight from a variety of colleagues and fans, get to all the press conferences. And you couldn't normally do that because if you look at 2026, the World Cup's in 3 different countries. So you follow England, or in my case, because CBS are American, the US men's national team. And then if there's an upset, you can't get there because you're hours away.
Yeah,
one hotel, one city. So the World Cup was great. And now coming back, I think the overriding thing that sources have told me, and I saw it firsthand as well during one trip from Qatar over to Dubai, where a range of teams were, and some were training in Abu Dhabi as well, is just a lot of the meetings, a lot of the business ahead of January was being done out of the UAE. It's a bit of a myth that clubs turn up at a World Cup, suddenly scout a player, suddenly meet a player, and suddenly get a deal done. You can bet your bottom dollar that the World Cup might change somebody's opinion, or might give them a green light, or might make them want to pay a bit more. But most top clubs like Manchester United will have scouted that player even before they've broken through. So if we talk about Ramos, for example, linked with Manchester United, he scores a hat-trick, but that doesn't influence Manchester United choosing to move. They've got a long-standing history scouting, considering that player, valuing that player, and that's why the meetings take place away from the World Cup, so clubs can kind of sneak under the radar. And then us as journalists, it's just no breathing time, really, because the World Cup ends, the Premier League restarts, the Carabao Cup before that, and then, of course, straight into the January window. So I'll sleep in February is really the only difference for me between a Winter World Cup and a Summer World Cup.
I was just going to say, it's good. I'm glad that you actually cleared that myth up about in terms of clubs transferring players in on the basis of just a World Cup performance. I mean, it's very rare that kind of thing happens. Now, I'm actually a Liverpool fan, Ben, and we've got the worst experience of that in terms of a few years ago under the great and God rest his soul, Gerard Houllier, where Salif Diao and Al Hadj Diouf were bought on the back of a World Cup, but it's far more advanced, far more developed since then. As you said, these big clubs have scouts out way before them, and as you said, it may influence a final decision because you always want to see if a player performs at the highest level, and there's no higher level than the World Cup. But in terms of the scouting and the research and the character the analytics and the character research. It's all done way before any major tournament like that, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, especially for Liverpool as well, because the transfer committee and the data-driven approach lends itself towards making decisions early. And the other thing I'd add just briefly is that within the market, you have to be 2 steps ahead, not just in terms of your club-specific planning, but your rivals as well. So I can tell you with Liverpool, for example, and Endrick, they approached the player and his family about a year ago, and they knew immediately that he was moving to Real Madrid, and that was the most likely scenario. And they never seriously entered that race. But that is what forward planning does. Absolutely. It predicts the market and it tells you when the right time to move is. Whereas with Chelsea and PSG, yes, they tried their luck. It all sounds very ambitious, but ultimately he joined Real Madrid. Liverpool always thought he was joining Real Madrid. So they're then confident in their intel. There's no rush. There's no panic. And I think that if you're Chelsea under new ownership, you love to be ambitious. The spending is impressive. The model is going to definitely be a threat to some rivals. So it's all very exciting, but you're kind of learning as you go. So then when we look at January, I think Chelsea will be busy in January out of necessity because they're 8th in the table, but also because they're under a new ownership group. I think Manchester United understand what Erik ten Hag needs now. So will be strategic, less busy, but they'll back him if they need to. And then obviously Liverpool are in a slightly stranger position because usually it's calm January, but due to injuries and again, a bit of urgency, we might see them be a little bit busier because we just know that to stabilize where they've been over previous seasons, they can't afford to miss out on Champions League. So I think it's very intriguing January off the back of a World Cup because Manchester United know that they need to replace Ronaldo and his goals from last season. And they know that Erik ten Hag is now moving everything in a direction that suggests that some kind of stability could be built. So that would imply a bigger January, but there are financial concerns and constraints. Liverpool have got a bit more money, but they've got summer targets. And do they escalate anything in January? And as I say, Chelsea have just got possible outgoings and still the need for incomings. So Premier League clubs collectively, I think, will spend in January, but not maybe to the tune and to the financial volume that certain fans expect.
Absolutely. It's a key point there. And I kind of wanted to kind of start the conversation with Arsenal because, you know, the top of the league, they're 5 points clear. They lost Jesus to an unfortunate injury, and he will be out for several months. They have Eddie Nketiah now available. Arteta spoke in the media saying that they will be active in January. What's the latest with Arsenal? Do they think that they can back Nketiah, or do you reckon they'll maybe go and get more? Because this is probably the best time to have to win the league, isn't it, Ben?
It is. And Arsenal have been here before, not necessarily as genuine title contenders, but if you look at last season, they got to the halfway stage and they even started January well. And then suddenly they had 2 wobbles and it ended up costing them Champions League football. And it looks like more of a decline because of how positive their first half of the season was. And we all know in that second wobble, they lost the North London derby, followed by away at Newcastle. And that was the difference. And that impacts your planning. So Arsenal now are hampered, if we go back to the summer, by the fact they didn't have Champions League football. But now they're in a point of opportunism in January because it looks like they're getting Champions League football and they can project the improvement at the club. But not only that, coupled with the stability of the fact that Arteta's still there, core players are still there. It's highly likely that Saka will sign. He's untouchable in the short term, but there might be a clause that allows him to go for a reasonable price in the long term because Manchester City are interested. Martinelli's contract won't be a problem. And Saliba's a bit more difficult, but I still fully expect him to sign as well. So they're building some internal stability as well as that faith in Arteta. In January, I think Modric is the priority. He's a player that I spoke to directly, and also Dario Serna, who's the sporting director there, another person that I've interviewed in the last few months. So Shakhtar's perspective with Modric is that they're not going to give any cut price deal, but they're purposefully quoting this 100 million euros figure and comparing him to the sale of Grealish. And they're doing that also partially to send a message to the market and maybe other suitors, but also it's PR. Because everyone knows behind the scenes that he's not going to go for 100 million. But if you've said persistently there's no cut price sale, and you say at the same time he's 100 million, then when you sell him for 60 to 65 million euros, it ultimately looks like you've done everything in your power to get an astronomical price. And when you settle for a lower price, it's still twice what Everton bid last summer. They bid 30 million euros. So 65 million euros looks like good business. And this is a deal that I think will happen. And I believe that Arsenal see as their primary focus. But I also think it's about the structure of the deal. So Arsenal want Modric, Modric wants Arsenal, but they need to agree a fee with Shakhtar. In practical terms, what does that mean? It means structure. And I think fans sometimes think about number, and no doubt we'll talk about Gakpo and Manchester United's number, but it's also about your payment installments. And on top of that, the other key factor is what else can you offer? Add-ons are the thing that most people will be familiar with. How gettable are they? But also Shakhtar will want a sell-on percentage. So they might get 100 million with base fee, hopefully from their perspective, paid in a preferable way, plus some add-ons that could take it to 65 million euros. Who knows? Maybe even 70, but I don't think Arsenal will go any higher than that. But then there's sell-on percentage. And if it didn't work out, or if Modric wanted another challenge in 3 or 4 years, he's going to go for still probably 30 million, even if he was a flop, 25 or 30 million. And if Shakhtar are pulling in another 20% of that, it's close to another 10 million euros or so. So then it all can add up to something closer to the number that Shakhtar want. So I think Modric to Arsenal is a very realistic possibility. João Felix is a bit harder because Atleti are not going to give any kind of major discount. He's unhappy there. He could very feasibly leave, but I think that Arsenal could be put off by the price. Talking to sources anyway. Same for Vlahovic in January. And also Arsenal weren't that happy at the fact they pushed quite hard last January and Vlahovic chose Juventus. So we'll wait and see whether they return. I think Chelsea in the summer might be a more likely destination. But Modric is the one that I think is the most likely of all of Arsenal's targets.
I just wanted to ask, if I may as well, Said, sorry. With the Modric situation, it always helps, doesn't it, when the player is kind of pushing for the move. So in this case, I think you said you spoke to Modric or people around him for sure, close to him. And it's very open that he's made it clear he's an Arsenal fan. Am I right in saying that? And that always helps in negotiations, doesn't it? Despite people thinking it's not really an issue because you can support someone else. But if the clubs can't agree, then there's not a lot you can do despite you being a fan. But it can help, especially in terms of the structure. You know, you can be a bit more flexible. And just one other thing on that as well. I wanted to ask you, what is the state of Shakhtar these days financially? Because we know that they're been sort of very financially backed in the last, I guess, decade or so. But I've not been catching up with sort of the financial state of affairs right now. Are they in a position to hold out kind of thing? Or do you think they will eventually fold, so to speak?
Shakhtar are relatively healthy. Actually, they've always done good business. They've qualified for the Champions League. Naturally, the war in Ukraine has an impact, and people may have been across a lawsuit where Shakhtar are asking for about 50 million euros in damages from FIFA over temporary transfer rules in place. So clearly they were hit hard by the pandemic, but not to the point where they feel they can't sustain themselves. Actually, their president has invested a lot in the club, but also in Ukrainian football generally, which tells you that they're fortunate because their ownership group does actually have capital away from the football club. And then with Modric, I interviewed him on record. The video is on the CBS website, but also on my TikTok. I reposted it recently. And if you have a player that intimates that openly that they want the move and they want it in the winter, then clearly Arsenal can use that to their leverage. I wouldn't quite classify him as an Arsenal fan, but I'd say he's a fan of Arsenal in the sense that he's watched the club, he likes Arteta's style. And this is a really small point, but the All or Nothing documentary can both help and hinder for any club. I'm not specifically talking about Arsenal, but when you open yourself up like that, if you're going to join Arsenal, you watch that documentary because you get a real sense of what's the manager like. Does he have a short temper? Is he going to be conducive to my personality? What's his man management like? And if you allow fly on the wall, it's authentic. And if it's authentic, why wouldn't you use that to see what you're walking into? And in addition to that, Modric knows both Zinchenko, but also his wife, who's a relatively high-profile journalist as well, and has interviewed him on record too. So it's about persuading a player like that, not just that Arsenal is the club he wants, but it's the move he wants. So what are his teammates like? What's the lifestyle like? What's the city like? Where will he live? His English is okay, but definitely not fluent. So who's going to help him? Who's going to translate if necessary? And it's all of these things, knowing you've got mentors, knowing you've got friends your age, knowing that London is a great city to live in, knowing little things like the distance between where he'll live and the training ground, who's going to drive him in, does he have a license, can he convert it to the UK? I think people forget that a player like that is human. They've been through a very difficult period because of the war in Ukraine. It's been quite emotional. There's a lot of media glare on him now. So having someone like Zinchenko that can help that transition is going to be a big factor. But it still all comes down, regardless of Modric wanting the move, the whole thing comes down towards whether a price can be agreed. Arsenal, I should add, have not actually tabled a formal offer yet. But when they do, if they don't hit the number or can't negotiate it, Shakhtar are not there to do Modric a favour. They're very tough negotiators. And if, as Dario Serna said, quote, their president is not respected, then the deal just won't be done. And that's basically what happened with Everton and with Brentford over the summer.
Absolutely. Considering as well, Grizz, you know, with Eddie Nketiah available, this is a must for Arsenal to go and get a striker, right? No disrespect to Eddie Nketiah, but the levels that Jesus has brought this year and the way that he's kind of fitted into Arteta's system, you know, it's a lot of pressure for Eddie Nketiah.
But this is why I'm not an Arsenal fan, so I won't have an insight like an Arsenal fan. But looking from the outside, Gabriel Jesus was bought specifically to play through the middle, through the center, be their main focal point. If they're going for Modric, who by all accounts is a wide forward stroke winger, they already have Saka and Martinelli. Does it suggest that Martinelli may be now shifted through the middle? Because Modric, from as far as I know, and I have to admit it's limited, he's not really a central striker. He may have the ability to play there. You know, we know Wenger used to convert all sorts of types of forwards into central strikers or wide forwards. But I don't know. I think they bought Gabriel Jesus for a specific role, and he's fulfilled that brilliantly so far. This is why I thought maybe and I know Ben's mentioned Vlahovic, and they certainly had massive, huge interest in him in the summer, but obviously he chose Juve. If the situation at Juve is a bit, let's say, sketchy, maybe that would have been a more a target for what they need right now. I don't know. Modric seems to be another wide man. It seems like they've got a few wide men. Also, Smith Rowe plays out wide. He probably comes back into it. I just think, don't get me wrong, it's a good signing and he's a very, very potentially good player. But I'm just thinking Nketiah still may have that important role that you're talking about, because he's still their main central striker as far as I know.
Absolutely. I think it just really comes down to, you know, Arsenal being very, very proactive in this transfer window, because it's an unusual transfer window when you look at it, Ben, because, you know, you've had a World Cup in between the season. That's never happened before, especially in my lifetime, probably everyone's lifetime. And, you know, you've used that time to find out talent. You know, you're looking at Unahi, you know, a player that I've never heard of, and he shelved and he became such an key, important player for Morocco. So many players have come out in this market, and more evidently, Cody Gakpo, who, you know, today I know you broke a story out. Today I seen your tweet. Man United now are very firmly interested. What's the situation with Gakpo, and whether, you know, these links are very, very true or not?
Well, I think there's a realization at the PSVN that they will have to sell Gakpo, and cashing in now off the back of an excellent World Cup is going to make the most financial sense. And the players had a very interesting path, because if we flash back to last summer, there was obviously that feeling that he'd be off to Leeds, and Gakpo said during the World Cup that it just didn't feel right. And the level of ambition to reject a Premier League club who offered good money then tells you that he was fully expectant on kicking on. and getting a deal done with somebody else. And Manchester United's interest in Gakpo is long-standing. We all know that Erik ten Hag has that ability to use a personal relationship and try and lure him over to Old Trafford. And to some extent, like Modric, it's going to come down to whether a deal can be done at value. And right now, the reason why Manchester United are confident is because they believe that PSV want this one done early, very early in the window, because there's two considerations. One is, are they going to let him go? And if they're bullish and have any kind of player buy-in, or even if they have an unhappy player, but they want to see the season through, then that's one thing. But if there gets to a point where they just accept, and Ruud van Nistelrooy has hinted at this, that the player will go, you've got to get it done as soon as possible. So one, you don't get into a Wesley Fofana Leicester situation where it impacts your dressing room. But two, and more importantly, so you get the money in quickly, so you then can move in the January market. And PSV's main consideration will be about, if they let the player go, do they have enough time within this window and enough income within this window to bring in one or two? And that's why when I reported on a possible agreement, I made it clear that structure is going to be as important as number. So if we look at fee, Manchester United value Gakpo, or would spend on Gakpo, 40 to 43 million, as I understand it, something in that ballpark. And then off the back of the World Cup, the valuation has been increased at the seller end by around 8 million, which takes it somewhere close to 50 million. And that might not seem like a lot, but obviously if Manchester United's starting point was 40 and PSV's starting point to play gamesmanship was 50 to 55, it becomes a bit more of a problem. But it doesn't take a rocket scientist to find a middle ground somewhere in the region of 45 million, maybe a touch less. And I think that all parties, even though they've not held the direct talks yet, but Manchester United are likely to escalate this pretty early in the January window. So if Manchester United proceed somewhere in that 45 million mark, it is a very acceptable starting point. But 45 million doesn't mean done deal. It doesn't mean just go up a few million. It doesn't mean can Manchester United go down a few million, because that's where structure comes in. And perhaps PSV would prefer 40 million all paid up front with some kind of gettable add-on on top, comparative to Manchester United saying, well, here's 47 million, but we don't want to really give you any gettable add-ons within that. Yeah. And also, by the way, we're paying that over 5 seasons. And that doesn't allow any lump sum up front for PSV to move within the market. So these are all considerations, but I think that there's a real feeling that if Manchester United were only to get one, that Gakpo would be the most realistic of targets. You could argue that they need more of an old-fashioned striker.
That's again.
Yep.
And obviously, then you start looking at Victor Osimhen, who won't be available in January, might not be available, by the way, in the summer either. Yeah, and having a phenomenal season. So it's very easy to make these connections. And obviously, there's what type of player do Manchester United need versus who is available and or realistic at this stage. And they may get more than one, but obviously it could be a scenario both financially and also logistically in January, because it is a quieter window where they have to prioritize one or the other. And the board might turn around to Erik ten Hag and say, listen, if you want a budget in the summer, we don't know yet if we've got Champions League football. We spent more than we'd planned the last window. So it is an either or with any player that is above 45 or 50 million. And therefore, Ten Hag might have to prioritize. But I think right now, as I reported, Gakpo is a very realistic possibility.
Saeed knows. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I look at it. I'm going to come to you, Chris, before I go back to Ben. You know, are you surprised Man United are going for a player like this caliber? Because we've lost Ronaldo, who was scoring goals, and he was a striker. Gakpo, possibly on the wing, possibly on the left. Are you surprised we're going for Gakpo, maybe not on Osimhen? Again, he's not available, but a kind of a prototype like that. Are you surprised?
You know my thoughts. I've been quite vocal on Cody Gakpo on my channel and other platforms in terms of, but the figure that Ben has spoken of, because the reason why I was a bit raised my eyebrows at was the figures quoted when I saw 60 million and 65 million. I thought, wow, He's just not a £60 million player, in my humble opinion. The reason why I know a bit about Gakpo is because when I say we as a Liverpool looked into Cody Gakpo before we went ahead with Luis Diaz. He was one of the names that we were linked with, and we actually made an inquiry for. Pep Linders is a huge fan of Cody Gakpo and calls him one of the most perfect forwards. But we know Pep speaks glowingly of many players and loads of players. So that's what caught my eye about Cody Gakpo. So when I tell you about Cody Gakpo and you say to me, "Oh, come on, Grizz, you can't say that he's had a wonderful World Cup." Well, I go back to my argument. I'm not basing him on just a World Cup. So since we were linked with him, obviously, I started keeping an eye on Cody Gakpo out in Holland. For me, I think he's got a lot to prove yet. And that's just me. Hopefully, if you get it, well, not hopefully. Hopefully I'm right and you get him and he turns out to be a dad, being a Liverpool fan. But I just think he's got a few levels to go yet. And maybe, Man United in the current situation are the perfect platform for him to go and revitalize a club. I just don't think you've got Sancho, who you're hoping to revitalize. I know he's going through issues. You've brought in Anthony for huge money. You've still got Rashford, who pretty much plays wide, not so much centrally. Maybe that will mean he gets another central berth. You've got Martial, again, the 7-year itch waiting for Martial to finally prove that he's a top Premier League player. Again, I don't feel he has proven that, whether it's through injury or form. And then you've got this Garnacho kid who's coming through as well.
Yeah,
everyone speaks so highly. So this is why I thought, if you're going to spend 40 to 45 million, maybe it's better spent for a central focal point of a type striker, which I feel you clearly lack. But hey, Ten Hag knows best, and who am I to speak against Ten Hag?
Ben, and this is the reason maybe why Grizz is coming from, but there is a lack of strikers out there. It's kind of mad. The striker market is dying, really. And are you surprised we're not going for an out-and-out striker? Or has Ten Hag got a system? He's got a plan to maybe fit Gakpo into maybe a striker, because his physicality is quite tall. He maybe have that presence. Could he make him into a striker? Is that the thinking behind it, do you reckon?
Well, I think the first thing to say is, just because Manchester United get Gakpo done, which is kind of a continuation of a desire from last summer, it doesn't mean that they won't go for another profile of forward as well. The reason for that is because even when Cristiano Ronaldo was still at the club, Manchester United wanted somebody else, almost a young forward that could be mentored by Ronaldo. So now Ronaldo's left and is very close, by the way, to signing for Al Nassr in Saudi Arabia with very few other options. Now he's gone from Manchester United. You could argue that there is actually a desire to bring in a creative-minded player that can score goals, that isn't an orthodox target striker or your most front-facing person within the formation played. And then you add a secondary person that is either that target or your furthest forwards. And when we talk about target, we obviously have to clarify that there's different kinds of targets. There's a Kai Havertz style player at Chelsea who's their furthest forwards in their formation, but isn't necessarily a Olivier Giroud style player that you're banging balls in left, right, and centre. Havertz can score with his head, but Giroud likes to be even further forwards and get in the box more often, whereas Havertz does that, but will link up the play a bit more too. And then with Victor Osimhen, scores a lot of goals. He's an absolute beast. But actually, if you said to him, we want you to go deeper and we want you to hold up the ball and we want others from midfield to run around you and we want wide players and people like Gakpo to cut inside, that intricacy and that deeper hold up play is not as much in his wheelhouse, but these are young players that can obviously improve. So I think there's a few considerations as to how you define a target man, and we shouldn't only look at it as the furthest player forwards within a formation. So if Manchester United go for Gakpo, who's to say that Gonzalo Ramos won't be another name that they try and pursue, and definitely on Manchester United's radar as well. And again, before the World Cup. So it's not a case of scored a hat-trick, replace Ronaldo. There's poetry there if he ends up replacing Ronaldo at Manchester United as well. It's not as simple as that. But there is a release clause in place, and it is a sky-high number at 120 million euros. So
Wow.
as I said before, if we take the World Cup out of the equation, over the course of the summer, Manchester United looked, PSG looked, Southampton looked, Wolverhampton Wanderers looked, and he nearly joined PSG, by the way, as well. But in the end, Benfica held on to him. He's having a phenomenal season too. He scored 18 goals for club and country, 14 for Benfica, and then 4 for Portugal, 3 of which famously came at the World Cup with that hat-trick against Switzerland. So the price has gone up even further. And Manchester United, when they inquired, and it's normal to inquire within the market, felt like even 45 million euros was too high. And some of the offers that came in from other Premier League clubs were closer to 30 million euros. Now, off the back of that hat-trick, Benfica, plus the release clause, can basically quote 50 million, 55 million. So we have to wait and see whether any suitor is actually prepared to get close to that valuation, because it will have only gone up off the back of that World Cup game.
But what also complicates deals or potential deals like this is, well, we know essentially Benfica's a selling club. We know they're one of the best sellers, the producers of talent. I mean, how many have they? You know, we've just bought Nunes off them last season. We also know the much heralded interest in another star, Enzo Fernandez.
Oh, please.
Now the chances of Benfica actually selling 2 of their crown jewels in the same summer, I'd say, is very low. And so therefore it totally strengthens their stance, or totally strengthens their position to ask for pretty much peak value for either player, because they know if they don't sell Fernandez for what they want to sell him for, they can sell Ramos for what they can sell him for, and vice versa. So this is what complicates deals for clubs such as Man United, who are possibly after Ramos, when they know, well, we've got Madrid, City, Liverpool chasing Fernandez on the other side. They can play a very cute game, can't they, in this situation?
They can. And with Enzo Fernandez, let's not forget, he's new to Benfica. He's only played
6 months or something, yeah.
And I know out there is a mystery alleged proposal for somewhere close to 100 million euros. But I can tell you as a journalist, if we ever report the word mystery to you, then
because we don't know.
We either don't know or we do know, and we've been sworn to secrecy, and it's about protecting whoever revealed that. And there's like a rare occasion where a chief scout might tell you, but it's a trust game around it's fine to put it out there, but we cannot be named. But usually that scenario doesn't exist, because nobody will want that type of business for that type of player put out there in the market. And the feeling from Premier League clubs, because what we do when these stories break, and it broke from the record in Portugal, is we go to Premier League clubs. And also I spoke to PSG, I spoke to Real Madrid, all of the likely contenders, because there's only a dozen clubs that could possibly and feasibly and financially make that kind of offer. And every single one of them denied it. And it is equally as likely that it's actually Benfica putting out there to a local outlet, we've had a massive offer. Why? Because they want to preempt the market and say, somebody, we won't tell you who, but somebody bid, and they bid 100 million euros and we flatly rejected it. And then everyone else in the market gets this message through the media that says, doesn't matter what you bid, he's going nowhere in January. He might not even be going anywhere in the summer. And there's a few players that fall into that category as well that just aren't going to be available in the January window. And if Enzo Fernandez was to leave, you're not talking 100 million euros. You're talking closer to 200 million euros, something so insane, so astronomical, so above market value, that then the recruitment team and the management team at Benfica would have to speak to their board, because it's a once in a lifetime financial opportunity. And nobody's going to be bidding that for him off the back of the World Cup. So I think that this is a key point. Fans perhaps want a target. Then they wake up and they see on social media or in the media something a bit clickbaity, and they're like, okay, we've made an inquiry, we're interested, it could happen. With this type of player, it's very much just sensationalism. And yeah, a club might make an inquiry, but with a view to 2, 3, 4 windows ahead. So Liverpool and Bellingham, they've been working on the player and the family over the course now, if we include January, of 3 windows. And that's how you land that kind of player. So just because somebody inquires, it doesn't mean it's for the now. And the other little known fact, just to give you a bit of insight into a window and the dynamic, is that often you inquire just for the sake of a yardstick. So perhaps you ask for a player you don't want, and you might even fuel the interest, and it's gamesmanship. So a lot of fans always think that it's agents or journalists fueling interest, but actually it's often big clubs as well. And they will put out there that they had a meeting with a player they don't want. And they'll do that because then they'll use that drive and media interest to go back to the player they do want in secret. And they might be like-for-like ages, like-for-like positions, like-for-like profiles. And suddenly that club is negotiating for the player they really want. And there's a like-for-like out there that's blown up in the media. And when you start saying to that club, we want to pay 40 for this player, and out there is that Liverpool are going to make an offer for 35 for a like-for-like player, maybe that club panic. Maybe that club realize you've got another alternative. So this complicates the market and makes it more chaotic, because even the clubs themselves will put a bit of false PR out there somewhere. And that's why us as journalists have that responsibility to go to the buyer, the seller, the players camp, and any other outlet we can find to try and get the consistency of narrative. If you don't have the consistency of narrative, you can only give the context. So during this window, a lot of people will say to certain journalists, definitely myself included, why are you covering that base and that base? Why are you sitting on the fence? It's because guess what? A transfer window is about sitting on the fence.
Absolutely.
Every single second.
Absolutely. You know what? And I can't tell you how much that is so true. We got a super chat here from Ajmal. Thank you very much, Ajmal. He's saying he's enjoying the show. Big up to Saeed, Grizz, and football.
$13.99.
Yeah, there you go. This people, they support the channel. So thank you very much to everybody that's watching. We are going to open up the question to the viewers if you want to ask Ben some questions. But before we do that, I just want to talk about the ownership situation. I know Grizz might have this question as well about the Liverpool ownership, but in terms of United ownership, does anything hinder on the situation with the ownership? Because would the Glazers want to buy players? Then it makes the club attractive. That's one sense. Or after this Gakpo situation, would it be a case of maybe sorting the manager out now and then later on leaving it to the new owner to sort out the summer transfer window? How do you see that conflicting situation there?
Not necessarily a conflict, because takeovers and minority investments take time. And because of that, the Glazers are locked into the budget for the season regardless. And if somebody comes in and takes over earlier, they'll assume that budget, or they might even increase it with a view to the summer window. But with January, the numbers have already been run. And because, as I said before, Manchester United overspent in the last window, their original budget, as I understand it, was only, I say only, but it's modern football, around 120 million. They ended up offering more money to Ten Hag because they realized that he needed backing later in the window. So that's the thing, rather than a prospective takeover or investor coming in that might influence Manchester United's situation. But they know that in order to be attractive to either an investor or a buyer and get the highest possible price, because of the time a takeover may take, they need to be on track for or have Champions League football. Otherwise, within the due diligence, or should it be granted period of exclusivity, the price will be altered. Chelsea's price was altered slightly because there were unpaid tax bills, and to cover them with not all of the information being apparent at the time, the price was reduced slightly. But you can bet your bottom dollar that the Glazers will be going around now valuing the club as if they're in a Champions League position, and also valuing the club based upon their digital assets, even though after Ronaldo left, we don't know how that impacts the digital space, because many young fans are followers of individual players rather than only football clubs. So a lot of the valuation is up in the air, and therefore the Glazers know this is going to take a little bit of time. And if things move quicker, it will lean towards minority investment. If things move slower, it will be more likely to be a majority sale. And as I understand it, they've explored all options. With Manchester United, There is nothing in a lot of the Middle Eastern links. That's the first thing to say. There is some interest from Saudi Arabia. There were some meetings within Saudi Arabia, but any notion of a Saudi-Qatari consortium or anything Qatari only is incorrect, as I understand it.
Oh, you just made my day so much. Like, oh, I didn't want to hear that, Ben. I didn't want to hear. I was dreaming of the oil money. I was dreaming of.
Saudi Arabia is still a possibility. That's the first thing to say. And they have a strategy called Vision 2030, with sport being a big part of that. And as you can imagine, if Ronaldo ends up joining Al Nassr, he'll be part of that. Messi is already an ambassador for the Saudi Tourism Board. And it is widely thought, even though the official line is that they haven't made up their mind that they'll bid for the 2030 World Cup. So clearly within that, Vision 2030 sports strategy, which is also about improving lifestyle and health in Saudi Arabia and creating jobs through sport. And if you add a World Cup bid, especially if it was successful, you can understand why Saudi Arabia might be interested, but it would come from the private sector. It wouldn't be via PIF. And therefore the government would support it, but not financially back it. But there's crossover, because once you own a football club, commercial deals get done. And that's where the government might have more of a direct role. But with Qatar, you have Qatar Sports Investment, who own PSG. They're happy at PSG. As I exclusively revealed about 4 months ago, there'll be a minority investment coming into PSG early in the new year, believed to be America-based. And PSG also invested a minority stake in Braga via QSI. So all of that shows you their commitment beyond the World Cup. And it's not therefore correct that just because the World Cup's finished in Qatar, QSI will say, we don't want PSG anymore. Let's buy a Premier League club. It's more marketable on the global stage. And anyone from Qatar, even in the private sector, that wants to be part of anything for Liverpool, for Manchester United, will have to first effectively, whether formally or informally, get the blessing of QSI, because they'll get nothing done if they assume control and they don't have the blessing of QSI. And that is why at the moment, there's no truth either for Liverpool or Manchester United in any Qatari links. And that includes the president of the Qatar Olympic Committee, who was the name that was put out there. It'll be private sector investment. And at this stage, there's nothing concrete out of Qatar. With Saudi Arabia, it'll be more interesting, because if somebody offers the Glazers in particular a lucrative above market value minority investment, that might be the first step. So once again, if things move quicker in January, it becomes more likely it's minority investment. And the final thing to say with both, but particularly Manchester United, is that Rain Group, overseeing the sale, are very experienced in finding investors. And the sale process for Rain is very much formed by Americans for Americans. So I would still be surprised with Manchester United, whatever happens, if whoever's involved doesn't have some kind of American link. And with Saudi Arabia, a lot of their key investors might be Saudi Arabian by name in terms of the organization, but they're all based out of New York, and they will have that relationship with Rain Group. So we have to wait and see. With Liverpool, I think the situation is a bit different, and everyone's talking about a new era at Liverpool, but actually they're quite calm about the situation, and there's a lot of respect internally for FSG. And I don't think FSG are in a tremendous rush. And as a consequence, confirming publicly that they're open to some form of investment was very genuine for me. And unlike Manchester United, who said, look, a sale could be a possibility, the FSG group were a bit more coy. So we might see a sale for the right price because they can make a 10 times return. But if the right suitor doesn't come, and it hasn't yet in an exclusive sense, they're not in any talks with only one prospective buyer. So that tells you that they're still looking at the market. And I think as they look at the market and the volume of interest in minority investment, they might lean in the new year towards minority investment, either with a view to a phased sale, because you can try before you buy as a minority investment. You can come in, you can take a small percentage, and then after that small percentage, if it works, you can find your feet, and then potentially you can ask for a bit more. And that might be a possibility. But I think that FSG are in less of a hurry than the Glazers, but no investment or sale happens in a hurry. Even Chelsea, which was an incredibly quick sale due to the circumstances, still took months. So people ask me for daily updates on this, and it's going to take a bit more.
It's going to take time. Yeah.
I think the last thing I'd just add is, like, when people are saying Apple, when people are saying Amazon, it's being firmly denied by these type of groups. So Amazon have a huge interest in sport, but I don't see them doing anything other than minority investment. And I still think that it's more still around TV rights for now, and then how they can commercialize that. And with Apple, it's a flat denial and a case of they've got actually MLS rights on Apple TV, and a lot of their time and energy and investment is in that market. And were they to expand to club ownership, again, I think it would be much further down the line.
Absolutely. I'm trying to get some question from the viewers, Ben. You've been amazing so far. Last 10, 15 minutes or so, we're going to put the questions out to the people. If you want to get your questions out, just write in the comments and we'll get as many as we can in the next 10, 15 minutes. Adrian Sheikh, big up to you. He says, is there any news about Chelsea buying a DM? Desperately needed. It's actually horrendous at this point. Will they make moves for first-team players in January? So DM and then just almost first-team players in January for Chelsea.
They will. I mean, 2 youngsters have already come into Chelsea. It's not been announced yet, but they're done deals. Santos and also Fofana, not Wesley Fofana, but Datro Fofana. And Datro Fofana is quite interesting to see whether he gets sent back to Mulder or on loan somewhere, or having just turned 20, if they see him as a first teamer that can potentially get some game time, because Amanda Broja, who's also young, is out until the end of the season. But it's a big ask because Broja had obviously been on loan at Southampton, scored Premier League goals, signed a new deal. West Ham were interested, whereas Datro Fofana will need more time to find his feet. So I expect Chelsea to bring in 2 first teamers as a minimum. They'll strengthen the forward line. That could just be a loan, though, because they've got some summer targets, with Vlahovic, as we mentioned, maybe being one of them. Jonathan David might be available in the market as well for the right offer. Still doing good numbers domestically, didn't have a great World Cup, though.
No.
And Ivan Toney, depending on the ban and the fallout from alleged betting offences, might be somebody that Chelsea put on their radar come the end of the season as well. And naturally, if you've got summer targets, you don't want to bring somebody in the short term that's of high cost and is of an elite level, and then find they get pushed down the pecking order. And that's the challenge with the midfield. So Chelsea's midfield needs revamping, both the DM and either a box-to-box midfielder or an attacking midfielder. And the advantage, say, with Jude Bellingham is that he can play, as he showed at the World Cup, next to a Declan Rice or in front of a Declan Rice. And these names will be mentioned, and a club like Chelsea will be in the race, but they're definitely not leading the race for Jude Bellingham. Liverpool are the front runners. Real Madrid are there. There's a real feeling in the industry that Manchester City might come in for Bellingham. So you have to have lots of targets if you're Chelsea in midfield, because you need to accept that you want Rice, but you might not get Rice. You want Bellingham, but you might not get Bellingham. And then there's January, and do they move a little bit earlier for a player out of necessity? And the paradox here is that when everyone's fit, yes, Chelsea need a revamp, and yes, Chelsea have got aging players, and yes, Kante could leave on a free, and Jorginho might sign a new contract, but could go to Serie A, and Juventus are interested, and Kovacic is aging as well, and then there's Conor Gallagher. But when you actually list them all out, if they're all fit, they've got a lot of names. So anyone coming in is going to be saying, if I join and you add in January and the summer, what is that going to do to my game time? And then specific names to answer your question. Edson Alvarez is still there. He didn't show up for training on the final day of the last window to try and provoke a move to Chelsea. And when he was told he couldn't leave, then Todd Boehly came back to the player and said, we'll come back for you. But now Chelsea have got a new recruitment team. So let's see whether Boehly keeps his word or if they've got other priorities. But he is one to watch for sure. And then other names are going to be mentioned, but they're just not possible in January. So loads of clubs and loads of media are linking Alexis McAllister. But ultimately, he's under contract at Brighton until 2025. And like Rashford at Manchester United and a few others, they can extend that until 2026. And if you look at both McAllister and Caicedo, who was also linked with Chelsea before the World Cup, those two players are young. They're getting regular game time at Brighton, And Brighton have sold a ton of players for a lot of money over the last few months and windows. They just got 62 million for Mark Cucurella, who's worth at best 30 to 35 in the market, an astonishing bit of business. So Brighton have no financial obligation to sell, and those players are going to be loyal to Brighton in the short term because they're young. I think it's going to take something insane for Alexis McAllister, even under a new manager, to return to Brighton just because he's a World Cup winner and say, I want to leave. I want to leave now. You've got to let me leave. And you've got to let me leave for a fair price. So January is not about that type of name. The same for Enzo Fernandez, the same for Declan Rice, the same for Jude Bellingham. Of course, we're going to run stories on them. Of course, there's going to be clickbait on them. Of course, decisions are going to be made in January with a view to the summer. But there's a realistic target in Edson Alvarez, and there's a long shot target in those other names that I've mentioned. But yes, Chelsea will strengthen in midfield, most likely, as the question rightly alludes to, defensive midfield. And then they're going to have to find goals in addition to that if they're to make a push for Champions League football.
I'm so glad that you mentioned Jude Bellingham and sort of the clubs that are interested in front runners, because we'll speak off air about that particular subject. But it's intriguing that a lot of those names are going to be linked with a lot of clubs, because what you've described in terms of the Chelsea need and the age of and the durability, let's say, of some of the players that you mentioned in terms of injury prone, whatever, it kind of just mirrors the situation at Liverpool as well. And so therefore the targets will be linked in terms of both clubs. And that I find that intriguing coming up to the summer and January, and more so the summer. And this is what makes negotiations and between clubs and links between clubs will be fascinating. I mean, it's going to be fun because pretty much the players that you've mentioned, give or take another 2 or 3, will be much sorted by the likes of Chelsea, Liverpool, possibly Manchester City as well, because Gundogan, because Bernardo Silva wanting to leave. They already lost Fernandinho last season. And then you're looking at sort of possibly again Manchester United, although I think they've shown it up with Casemiro and a couple of others. But a lot of these clubs are looking to revamp their midfield. So it's going to be fascinating. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Just to briefly add on that, from Liverpool's perspective, they did something quite unusual in Artemelo and moved quite late, and also out of a necessity due to injuries. But that deal has what's known as a give in it, in the sense that Liverpool agreed to a fee for an option to buy, which will do at times, and it's a negotiation tactic. So when you only want to loan someone, and Liverpool, believe me, only want to loan Melo, no interest whatsoever in buying. But you sometimes are forced to agree to an option to buy. And that means that if for whatever reason he sets the world on fire and you've got no choice to buy, the price is high, and suddenly the selling club have got all of the cards falling in their favor. And that is why it's added. And when you want the loan and you want it done quickly, you have to agree to the give. But Liverpool have never had any indication that they wanted to buy Melo or saw him as anything other than short term, which is why it was so disappointing when he got injured. And apparently he's such a hard-working lad, and he's such a likable character that everyone was very much gutted when he first got injured. And then looking forward to what, say, Liverpool might do, either in their midfield or other positions, as ever, and I'm sure Liverpool fans will be sick of hearing it, but Jurgen Klopp is being very genuine when he says that he'll only buy if the right opportunity presents itself. He'd rather have what he's got than just buy for the sake of it. So as I can see from the question there, Amrabat is one player that has been linked with Liverpool for sure. And we know, again, as I mentioned right at the top of the show, that Liverpool had looked at Amrabat in terms of their scouting long before the World Cup, still at a very good age as well, only 26. And I haven't actually seen team of the tournament yet, but Anahi and Amrabat should both be in there. And Fiorentina's position is very clear. They don't want to sell mid-season, but he's been there a little bit longer, and it will again depend on the financial amount and the structure of the offer. And this is where you want player power, not just if you're Liverpool, but there's a few suitors, as you would expect, looking at Amrabat. So what you have to do is, and Tottenham will find the same as well, they're the other Premier League club that have at least scouted the player. There's nothing more to this at this point, but Liverpool and Tottenham, as you would expect, have looked at this. And Liverpool actually sent some scouts over, as every team would do at the World Cup. But remember that Liverpool were in Dubai. So Liverpool's scouting team would come over to the World Cup if they wanted to watch matches. And I'm not going to say what matches, because I won't breach a particular source that is a very close friend of mine at Liverpool. But it's clear as a journalist, when you know what matches they've come from, you can narrow down what players they're looking at. So I found that quite interesting with Liverpool. But Amrabat is a possibility. But again, I reiterate what I said before, for Spurs, for Liverpool, for any clubs looking at him, that Fiorentina really don't want to lose him mid-season. I think Anahi, not for Liverpool specifically, is a more realistic possibility, because Onguers would take the money and allow that player the opportunity. And then with Liverpool, there's a few others that have been linked. There's nothing in the Pulisic link, by the way. I can categorically tell you that it's all from the agent offering to Liverpool, and Newcastle are a more realistic destination, but even they have got their concerns. And that's a sort of catch-22, because the club's asking Chelsea about Pulisic, want to loan, and Chelsea are saying, make a permanent offer or an obligation to buy. Otherwise, we're not interested in just loaning him out to a Premier League rival. So Liverpool and Pulisic won't happen. Trossard and Liverpool also won't happen. It's all coming from the agent, and Liverpool have no interest in either of those two.
And the last question, just to kind of round up this wonderful, wonderful rivals talk, is one of your players. I know you're a big Leicester City fan. Tielemans. I mean,
I'm not sure you were supposed to reveal that, Saeed, but you've done it now.
No, I think
that's
you know,
okay.
no, he's a proud.
It's in the
bio.
Okay, then that's fine. Yeah, it's in the bio.
Yeah, no, once it's on your bio, that means you're loud and proud.
No, I know a lot of people in the industry that don't like to reveal the club that they support. You know, sometimes it could be sort of maybe some conflict of interest somewhere, but no.
Yeah, no.
Ben's proud.
Leicester fan.
Yeah.
I am a proud Leicester fan. Covered them in the Premier League, and if anything, you're harsher about your own club, because people know you're a Leicester fan, so you turn up actually being more critical than most, rather than what people assume, which is that somehow you're going to be biased towards them.
Yeah,
Tielemans is a fantastic player. He's in brilliant form at the moment. You only have to look at the goals against Everton and Wolves to see that. So I'll wrap up with Tielemans and Maddison, but just because I don't like people to feel left out, and I know that my answers are quite long, feel free to DM me if you have a specific question. I did a Q&A yesterday, so I'm always happy to try and get through as much as I can. I've seen some in the chat about, will United sign a right back? Very possible that they will look at a right back in the January window. And I've also seen people ask me about Ronaldo, as myself and my colleague James Benge revealed exclusively the Al Nassr deal. Very real possibility. We were the first to reveal the club. And it's a strange but very intriguing deal, because it's not just a football deal. He could play into his 40s, but he could get ambassadorial and government-backed roles that will see him earn upwards of 160 million a season. And I don't see why Ronaldo, if he doesn't get a European offer, won't take it in the next few days. A lot will just depend on what else Jorge Mendes can find. But there's so many outs in the deal for Ronaldo that allow him to leave, that it's very low risk, because he could stay for half a season, get fit. If an offer comes in from a European club in the summer, he could move. If MLS comes in, he could move, and he could still maintain the non-football parts of the deal, which allow him to earn very handsomely. So I see this as a kind of succession into Ronaldo's retirement and life after football. Some will say it's greedy, some will say it's a fall from grace, but ultimately there's no other offer on the table. You're 37 years of age and you can earn close to 200 million euros a season, but also you can set up your life and your brand for after football. Then you can understand why that might tempt him. And the last thing I'd say on that is just, he's going to have to work out on the football side what it's going to be like in Saudi Arabia. And I say that having been to Saudi Arabia, and I say that when considering his family, should they go over with him? But I also say that specifically on football culture. So there's others that either are Saudi Arabian or have been in Saudi Arabia that can talk to the lifestyle, the culture. I've been over there a few times, and like with Qatar, it's not what you think. And you can live a much more Western orientated life if that's what you choose to do. But my point is more about in the MENA region, these games are kicking off at 10 o'clock. You're not getting home until 2 in the morning. The media takes longer. The training is in the afternoon, not in the morning. And Ronaldo's going to have to work out whether that lifestyle change of basically eating his dinner potentially at 2 a.m., of finishing a game and coming back from an away match by 3 a.m., of having nothing to do in the mornings, and then when it gets a bit cooler, turning up to training at 6 p.m. And I know these might not seem like big problems, but Cristiano Ronaldo has lived a almost robotic-like routine of elite level, very rigid, athlete-led choices throughout his entire career. So if you suddenly say to Ronaldo, training's not at 9 a.m., it's at 9 p.m., that might be a deciding factor. If you say to him that buffet that they put on for all the players has got different food, if you say to him that it's split training because you're going to break for prayer, if you say to him that during Ramadan, depending on when it falls, because Ramadan moves, so it impacts each season, things might be different. There may be a break. All of this could be a factor, as could climate. You just don't know. And he's going to have to think long and hard about everything. And then with Tielemans and Leicester, Tielemans doesn't want to sign a new deal at Leicester. Arsenal are the front runners. I was wrongly quoted as saying Chelsea. What I said is that Chelsea might look for a player like Tielemans, and he's exactly the kind of name who, if he becomes available later in the window, clubs might try their luck because they know they can lowball Leicester. And if no new deal is established, Tielemans will go for a free in the summer. But Arsenal are really the most seriously interested club, as they always have been. It's just about timing and whether Arsenal want to move in January or whether they're going to milk the opportunism of having locked in personal terms with Tielemans almost a year ago and feeling like he wants the move. Can they just come in and delay until the summer and then get him for nothing? So it's not impossible that Arsenal move, but there's also a very realistic possibility that Leicester just keep Tielemans for the entire season. And if they can't get him to sign a new deal, which is obviously what they'd love, if only to protect the value, as they did with Fofana, they then will have to be resigned to the fact that he'll go. And Arsenal are still there, make no mistake about it. And Maddison is the other name I suppose we can talk about. Leicester want to offer Maddison a new deal. Maddison also would prefer, I think, unless an astronomical offer in excess of 60 or 65 million comes in, that makes the Leicester board rethink, and they have to rethink less because they've already got that Fofana money in. So their finances are much healthier than they were during the summer. But Leicester want to move for players. Leicester are very much in the conversation for Anahi, as far as I understand. So we wait and see with Maddison, but I'd be very surprised if Maddison goes in January, not just because it would take such a massive offer, but also because Maddison in the summer knows what he's getting. So Newcastle want Maddison. Very loosely, there's a growing interest from Tottenham. But both those clubs can't tell Maddison now what he's going to get. If Maddison waits until the end of the season and is Leicester's player of the season, Leicester get good money should he not sign. And I want to reiterate that Leicester would love Maddison to sign. So they're not just going to give up and say we're going to lose Maddison. But if we go down the logic that he didn't sign, then you got Spurs and Newcastle. And if Maddison negotiates with Spurs and Newcastle in the summer, one, he knows which one, if any, has got Champions League football. And two, he's able to ask for Champions League wages and a lot more because those clubs will have more money to spend should they get Champions League football. So I'm not really expecting that much drama at Leicester. I think it's down to if somebody gives Leicester money for Tielemans and they really sense that he won't go and sign a new deal, they have a decision to make. But Tielemans has been given the Leicester captaincy at times this season. So it's not like they're planning for life without him. So Tielemans, Arsenal, one to watch. Maddison, Newcastle and Spurs, but more for the summer. And don't be surprised if Leicester persuade Maddison to stay, because it's a myth that he's just desperate to move. You know, what he wants is European football. But Leicester's form has turned. And Maddison has been in incredible form all season. So I think that Leicester will do everything in their power to try and get Maddison to extend. And we wait and see what happens with both.
It's going to be fascinating. It's going to be fascinating. And on that note, we're going to end the show here. Rivals Talk Grizz. It's been a pleasure. This is probably the start of something, you know what I mean? Bringing some guests on the Rivals Talk Grizz. If you enjoyed it.
Oh, I've thoroughly enjoyed it. It's been magnificent. I've really thoroughly enjoyed Ben's company. Insightful, fascinating, and yeah, it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely. That's all I can say for me on my behalf. Thanks for coming on, Ben. And like I said, if you want to follow him, Ben, check his Twitter out. In the link is in the description. Honestly, one of the most underrated for me journalists out there, especially on Twitter as well. Always reporting. Always, for me, notifications are on for you, Ben. So pleasure. And thanks and good luck for the January transfer window. It's going to be busy for you.
Yeah, look forward to it. And once again, reach out with questions. I always try in the DMs and answer them. And most importantly, away from the football, I hope that everybody has a happy festive period, whether it's Christmas, Hanukkah, New Year, or other. I hope that everyone gets a little bit of time off and has a happy, healthy, and successful 2022.
Absolutely. Thanks for us on our behalf. Please do like the video on your way out. Subscribe to my channel. Subscribe to Grizz Khan TV. And we'll see you soon, guys. Take care. Bye.